You're listening to the Whole Hog Football Podcast, sponsored by Landers Toyota of Northwest Arkansas. Every Monday through Friday during the Razorbacks football training camp, bringing you the latest news, position analysis, and more. Here's your hosts, Matt Jones and Scotty Bordelon.
We're a little over the halfway point of Arkansas's fall camp. The Razorbacks went through another practice Wednesday morning. They'll practice again Thursday morning and Friday morning before their second and final scrimmage of the preseason. They'll do that Saturday morning inside Razorback Stadium. Like last week, the scrimmage will be closed to the public, closed to the media. We'll get some thoughts from Sam Pittman after it on Saturday afternoon. Matt Jones with Scotty Bordelon and Andrew Joseph of WholeHogSports.com. And we're into the portion now of preseason practice where we get to talk to the coordinators. Since Sam Pittman became the head coach, Arkansas has only made their coordinators available a couple of times each year, typically once during the preseason, once during the spring. There was also a point right after they were hired where they were made available for interviews. But it's a much different structure that Sam Pittman has for his assistant coaches than his predecessors had. Sam Pittman wants his coaches focused on recruiting, and that's where they spend their time more so than doing interviews. So it's always an interesting time when we get a chance to talk to coordinators. On Wednesday morning, it was Scott Fountain, the special teams coordinator. Kendall Briles and Barry Odom will talk over the next couple of days. Scotty, you were there this morning. You listened to Scott Fountain. What were some of your takeaways listening to him talk about his special teams group?
I think the question every year that's posed to Scott Fountain is, can you be better on special teams? And I think he feels pretty confident that they will be. I mean, look at the kicker position. Cam Little is the guy, I think, probably in a battle with Jacob Bates for kickoff, but the place kicking position is literally Cam Little's to lose. I mean, he would probably have to go out and miss 5 or 6 straight kicks before he was standing on the sideline during a field goal situation. I think there's a lot of trust in him, and kicked the ball super well as a freshman. A lot of times when freshman kickers aren't trusted that often, but I think there's something unique about Cam going out and performing for a bigger purpose. I wrote about a story about him last year, and just kind of what motivates him for games. You look at kickoff return and punt return. Arkansas had 147 kickoff return yards, 120 the year before that. So I think this is the year that Scott Fountain really wants to see more productivity in terms of kickoff return. And I think at punt return, you got some interesting options back there. Harper Cole is probably a little known receiver, but Scott Fountain kind of likened him to Nathan Perotti, who was kind of a sure-handed guy who took over the punt return duties when Traylon Burks was having some issues with letting the ball hit and roll. And then Jayden Hazelwood's back there. I think he's an interesting option. He hasn't returned punts before, didn't do that at Oklahoma. And Bryce Stevens, I think he's probably the most logical guy to throw back there at this point. He's got some experience doing that last year. I think he had a nice kickoff return or a punt return against UAPB, and then he did the same thing against LSU. So got a little bit of a track record there.
One of the things that stands out to me, and I wrote about this in our summer preview magazine, is the fact that Arkansas has got all these scholarship players on special teams now. When you're talking about your long snapper, Eli Stein, Sam Lane had a good feature about him on our site at WholeHogSports.com this morning. You've got obviously the scholarship kicker in Cam Little, and you've got a scholarship punter in Max Fletcher, who Scott Fountain, said that it's going to go down to the wire between he and Reed Bauer. Or it could be an instance this year, like we've seen in the past, where they might be in a certain spot on the field where they like one punter over the other. It would surprise me if we don't see both of the punters play this year, barring an injury or something. But the other thing about special teams play, in addition to the scholarship players, is, well, let me finish this thought. When you have scholarship players, I think it goes to show that you put a real priority on special teams. And Sam Pittman talked about that last year, ironically, the week after the Mississippi State game on his coach's show, because, the week before Cam Little had hit 3 of 4 field goals, and a field goal ended up being the difference when Arkansas won that game 31-28. And then it just so happened that 3 days after he made those comments on his coach's show, Cam Little kicks 3 more field goals, and they beat LSU in overtime on a Cam Little field goal, 16-13. Just, those comments were about how when you put emphasis on special teams, it pays off for teams that do that, and there aren't a lot of teams that will devote scholarships to special teams players, let alone, special teams players at 3 different positions. And so, it's a really interesting concept that Arkansas has, that they're willing to part ways with those 3 scholarships and put them towards special teams, but that can win you some games sometimes. But where I was going to go with all of this a minute ago is that I think one of the areas where you see the difference between the really great teams and the teams that are maybe good or average or mediocre is special teams. And a lot of it has to come down to your depth and the quality of your depth, the quality of your second and third teamers that you might put on your special teams units. Some teams are okay putting starters out there. Arkansas's got a number of starters that are going to be on various special teams units. But I think that's where you're going to see Arkansas be a lot better in special teams this year, is that they're now recruiting at a higher level, and they've got better athletes. They've got better speed in a lot of positions, bigger players in a lot of positions. I just think all of that kind of, works together to create a better special teams unit. And it would be surprising, to Scotty's point, if they are not better this year than they were a year ago.
Yeah, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but in the early years of Sam Pittman's tenure, when I think Scott Fountain were just started, wasn't special teams kind of like the one area that came under fire a lot? And Scott Fountain even individually as well took a lot of heat for that unit, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. It was either, penalties. Penalties were a huge deal. It seemed like every time Arkansas lined up, to punt or to kick off, penalty, or somebody jumped off sides, or false started, excuse me. I think that has gone, like the frequency in which that's happened has gone down a little bit, as time has gone on. And I think guys are buying more into what Scott Fountain is teaching. But yeah, I mean, that, and, even punt protection, like the shield wasn't always as strong as it should have been. I remember Arkansas, I think, had a punt blocked against Georgia in the season opener in 2020. That was Scott Fountain's first game. And I think later in that year, when Arkansas was at Auburn, I think a blocked punt maybe kind of cost them the game there. So there's definitely been some concerns. And that was kind of what I asked about him, or that's what I asked Scott today. Just like, how have you guys looked in camp so far in terms of like protections and penalties? And, it's camp. It's, they're just working through their second week right now. There's obviously some things to clean up, but he's looking for a lot more, sound work from his, all of his special teams units in the second scrimmage on Saturday.
I've talked to some special teams players about this before, and it's that they had problems in various areas of their special teams that first year. But what, they told me was that they thought it spoke to Fountain's coaching ability, that when they had those problems, they had this leak, so to speak, that he was able to patch it up, whether by putting a new player in or, putting in some new concepts, and where it wasn't something that was a problem all year. Say like Scotty mentioned, they had the punt protection problem against Georgia and against Auburn. Those were the first and third games of that year. It was better later in the season. I remember that year they had some issues, I think, with their holding. He wanted to have, I'm talking about their holder for field goals and extra points. He wanted to have his punter be the holder. That wasn't working out, so they brought Jack Lindsey back in, and they didn't have any more problems with their holder the rest of the year. And I remember writing about this a couple of years ago. I can't remember what all the issues were, but I think I seem to remember there were like 4 or 5 deals where it was a problem for one game or 2 games, and then it was fixed, and you didn't hear about it the rest of the year. And then last year, for the most part, I thought special teams play was pretty good for Arkansas. Little had a great year, freshman All-American. Vito Calvaruso was a really good kickoff specialist for them. That's one of the areas that they've got to figure out this year. Jordan Silver was obviously a real consistent deep snapper. I think, for the most part, if you take away, say, like maybe the first half of his first season, the special teams have been fairly consistently not great, but good for the Razorbacks under Fountain.
Yeah, I think, Sam has talked a lot about in camp just being a bigger, faster, stronger team. And when you hear that, I think a lot of people's minds go immediately to the offensive line is bigger, the receivers are faster, the defensive linemen are stronger. I think what people tend to forget is that, a lot of guys that aren't seeing the field on offense and defense. I mean, obviously some guys that have a role on offense and defense play on special teams too, but maybe you start getting a little bit more into your depth. putting together your special teams units. And I think that's where the added strength, speed, and quickness and all that, I think that's where a team can go from being, average to good or good to great, just when you can utilize all that talent that maybe you're not able to get on the field in the other two phases. I think that's when you start to see, special teams units really, make strides and are able to make impacts in games.
Yeah, we talked about the personnel and having scholarship players on special teams. The fact they've got a special teams coordinator. There aren't a lot of teams that have that. You remember for years people were screaming, Brett Bielema needs a special teams coordinator at Arkansas. There are a lot of teams.
Chad Morris
that
needed one too.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of teams that don't put that emphasis on having a specific coordinator for that phase of the game. They'll bring in a position coach, or multiple position coaches will have, and position coaches still have roles within special teams at Arkansas, but to have one person overseeing it, it's different than it is within a lot of other programs. And Fountain has been part of some good ones in the past. He was at Auburn and Georgia before he came here with Sam Pittman, who he said was his neighbor in Athens. They had an open practice this morning again. Scotty, you were over there. Andrew, you were over there. Tell us what your observations were from from the practice time this morning.
Yeah, they went indoors today just because, early this morning it was pretty gross out. It wasn't raining super hard, but it was just, the drizzle was heavy enough for it to be kind of annoying. Arkansas's offense and defense were inside Walker Pavilion in the indoor. The poor kickers and punters and those guys, they were out in the rain. And I think Scott, one of the things that I thought was interesting that Scott said today was he was glad that the kickers got to work outside in the rain just to kind of battle the elements a little bit, because not going to be 95 and clear skies every single Saturday that you play. So it's good to kind of deal with a little bit of that. Fastball starts are obviously a point that I obviously a segment of practice that I like to watch, just because that's about the only real action that we get most days. KJ had a deep pass to Ketron Jackson for what would have been probably a 60 or 70 yard touchdown. Ketron just flew right by Miles Slusher and cruised into the end zone. I mean, it was the kind of play that I was really wanting to see from Ketron, as we've heard a lot about Landers and Hazelwood and Warren Thompson here and there too. But Ketron, I think, is that really important fourth piece in that receivers group, and to see him make a big play was pretty important. When the twos ran out there, Malik Hornsby, I think it was his first or his second. I think it was his second pass. Latavius Branny broke on it and made a really nice pick. And I think the thing that was more impressive to me than the pick, which showed really good anticipation to even make that play, I was a little bit right of the right seam. So he, covered a little bit of ground and read Malik's eyes there. But like a couple of seconds after Branny picked the pass off, he dropped the football and then ran back to his position at safety just to get ready for the next snap. And so I think that just kind of shows that, these guys are really locked into, I just made a good play, but got to move on to the next snap because it's coming really fast. And I think there were still 2 plays in that rack left. Drew Sanders, he did go through the fastball start period. Bumper Pool did not, but Bumper was at practice. And then on the offensive side, I didn't have Matt Landers or Jayden Hazelwood on the first team offense, but they were at practice today, just getting other guys some reps at receiver.
The fastball starts are obviously a way to see who's getting a look where and on what depth chart rank they are at. But something I've noticed the past 2 or 3 days is Dwight McLaughlin running with the threes at cornerback, and that kind of surprised me based on his play and what I've seen in limited time. Obviously, we haven't seen everything, but he's probably been the most impressive cornerback to me.
Yeah, and I think the last couple of days too, we've seen Ladarius Bishop with the first team corners opposite Hudson Clark. Last week it was Malik Chavis opposite Hudson Clark. So I think there's maybe more of a position battle there. Maybe they're just getting Ladarius Bishop some reps just to see if he can take advantage of some first team snaps. Something else that I've noticed too is, Cam Ball, I think it was a third practice of the preseason. Tom reported that Cam left practice and I think had to be transported to the hospital. He's back and running with the second unit. Terry Hampton was alongside Cam Ball on that second team defensive line at tackle. Those two guys take up a lot of space in the middle of the line. I think those two guys have a real shot to produce, behind Isaiah Nichols and Eric Gregory or whoever's playing alongside Isaiah Nichols. Trent Gordon was at second team nickel. There was a stretch of the preseason when they were doing these fastball starts where I didn't see Trent Gordon a whole lot. But he's back there. Jordan Crook and Jackson Woodard at linebacker. Jordan Dominic was at one of the defensive end spots. And Dorian Gerald, he's running with the third team at end right now. Oh, and also Nico DeVilliers, kid from Maumelle. He's a guy that Sam and Deke Adams both said that they really liked. He's a monster of a kid for as young as he is. I think he's like 6'3" or 6'4", legit 280, and just got really, really good size. I think he's making some impressions. He's kind of worked his way into that third team group. And Dwight Mclaughlin has been running with the third team all week. I think he made a pass breakup earlier in a practice. I think it was maybe Monday. It's been interesting to see him slide down to that third team. Honestly, I don't know. Obviously, we don't see just a ton of live work, so we don't actually know if he's running with the third team, but he's been there pretty consistently this week. But I'm thinking that, since we saw Chavis running with the ones last week at corner and Bishop running with the second group last week, I think they're just trying to mix some things up and just seeing how guys would respond to, just being with different groups.
Yeah, might be a matter of seeing how they communicate with one another on the field. A little news item here. Jalen Catalan was named to the preseason All-America team today by CBS Sports. Doesn't really mean a whole lot, but it does mean that there's a lot of expectations for Catalan this year. Certainly postseason All-America honors are the ones that we remember. And then I think you all saw the ESPN article that came out today that ranked the 100 best players in college football. There were 3 Razorbacks on this list. 2 of them I expected. One I was surprised by. KJ Jefferson comes in at number 32. Bumper Pool comes in at number 39. And Catalan came in at number 66 on that list. Jefferson and Catalan did not surprise me. I was really surprised, Scotty, to see Bumper Pool be considered so highly nationally at his position. I mean, you ask a lot of people, they may even say that Drew Sanders is a better linebacker than him on his own team. I wonder how much of this is, the big tackle number that he has. Not to say that Pool's not a good player, but you're talking about the 39th best player. You're talking about a guy that might go second, third round in the NFL. I don't know that I really see that from him.
Yeah, I would think that a lot of that ranking probably hinges on the big tackle number from last season. Like you mentioned, like 125 tackles. That's pretty dang impressive. I mean, but if you would have told me that those guys were, if you would have just said KJ, Bumper, and Catalan were ranked whatever numbers they were, I probably would have thought that Bumper would have been in the 60s and Catalan would have been in the 30s. I just think Catalan just as a whole has a greater impact maybe on games. But, I mean, Bumper is ultra productive. And there's really, other than the way that Drew Sanders runs, I mean, there's not really much telling me that, Bumper can't, crack 100 tackles again, maybe approach 125 again. That's really, really hard. That's obviously barring any injuries. I think he could probably get to that 100 mark again. And Michael Scherer obviously was saying the other day that there's just a couple things that he's working with Bumper, that could push him from 125 to like the 150 mark. I don't remember the last time, Arkansas had a linebacker put up those types of numbers, but Scherer obviously thinks he's very capable of it, just making a few tweaks to his game.
Yeah, I think a lot of people forget about Catalan because he missed, a lot of important games for the Razorbacks last year with that injury. He was a redshirt freshman. He was a semifinalist for the Thorpe Award as the best defensive back in the country. Basically, I think it comes down to CBS had somebody who thought really highly of him. ESPN probably had somebody or a panel of voters who didn't think quite as highly of him. I was surprised to see Ricky Stromberg not be on the top 100 players because I think he's really good. I think Stromberg's going to have a big year for them. And I think he's going to be the type of player that when the season's over, maybe even while the season's going on, you're going to hear a lot about him in terms of his NFL future, because I think he's got a future in the NFL.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That would probably be the biggest omission for me. Yeah, I was a little bit surprised that like none of the four guys, you go from left guard to maybe right guard. I don't know that I would put Dalton Wagner necessarily in that group, top 100 players, but yeah, definitely. I think Ricky deserves some consideration for that. Bo Limmer, Brady Latham. I think those guys, if they do an end of season top 100, I think one of those three guys, if not two of them, could probably jump in there if Arkansas has a good season protecting the quarterback and running the football. Going back to Catalan for a minute, me and Bob went out to an Old Spice School of Swagger youth football camp in late June, and KJ, Hazelwood, and Catalan were out there as kind of like camp counselors. Just I guess it was part of an NIL deal, but they were out there, and I talked to Catalan and just asking him what it was like to be back and kind of his expectations for the season. And I wrote a story on this. He just, he's a guy that's proven to have been productive in the past, but he's like, I feel like people have forgotten about me a little bit. And he's that's put a big chip on his shoulder. And I remember Andrew a couple of days ago, he mentioned that Catalan wiped out a receiver just in a drill where I think Catalan was just supposed to try to strip the guy, but he just completely knocked him on his backside. So he's still the same old guy that Arkansas fans have kind of grown to love the last couple of years. Big hitter, just kind of runs around with a reckless abandon. He's still that same guy. And I think that if they make an end of the year list, he'll be much, much higher than in the 60.
To make an end of the year top 100 list, who's somebody that's coming out of left field for Arkansas that could potentially be on that? Somebody we haven't mentioned.
First name that came to mind was Jayden Hazelwood. I think he could, if he lived up to his billing out of high school, he would definitely be a top 100 player in college football. I think it's about time for him to, if he's going to live up to those expectations, this is this year to do it. Other than that, I could see Rocket Sanders having a breakout year and becoming a household name in college football as well.
Yeah, I think my mind went to, if not Hazelwood, I think it would be Rocket. I think he's a guy that can get over 1,000 yards the way that Arkansas's offensive line pushes, and just as elusive and strong as he is, he might be able to push 1,200 yards too. I mean, I think if there was like a legitimate dark horse, it could be Trey Knox. Like if he settles in more at tight end, and I think he's a guy that KJ really likes to target just because he's so reliable. He's got really good hands. And Trey can impact games too, just because he's become such more of a willing blocker. And I think that's that right there, that physicality element to his game, I think could really change people's perception of him.
Yeah, those were all names that I thought about too. And, again, we haven't seen just a whole lot of live practice, but I wonder about a player like Matt Landers, because you hear really positive things about him in practice, and he's just such a big body, got so much speed. And it seemed like, whatever wasn't working for him at Georgia, he really got it turned around last year at Toledo, became a real big play receiver for them. I think he led the nation in touchdown catches of 80 or more yards. It just seems like this might be the type of offense where he could come in and thrive. And, you don't have to make a whole lot of big plays to leave an impression. You've seen that with players in the past. You hit a couple of 60, 70, 80 yarders, and all of a sudden people remember your name. So that may be a dark horse as well for Arkansas. The Whole Hog Football Podcast is sponsored by Landers Toyota of Northwest Arkansas, where you always get the best service and the best buying experience in the state.
For all your automotive needs, shop Landers Toyota NWA in Rogers, where we guarantee you the best buying experience and best service after the sale in Arkansas. Landers Toyota NWA in Rogers.
WholeHogSports.com has the largest, most experienced staff of reporters covering sports in Arkansas. Football, basketball, baseball, recruiting, and more. You'll find it at WholeHogSports.com. The website includes up-to-minute news, daily commentaries, and award-winning photography from the staffs of Hogs Illustrated and the Democrat Gazette. For subscriptions, call 1-800-757-6277. That's 1-800-757-6277. Or visit us online today, WholeHogSports.com.
Want more coverage of your home team? Download the Whole Hog Sports Video on Demand app. Check out the Fan Zone and get up-to-the-minute videos, podcasts, and features on football, basketball, baseball, recruiting, and more. Search for Whole Hog Sports on Apple TV, Roku, and Amazon Fire at home. And take it with you on the go by downloading it for your mobile device in your app store. The Whole Hog Sports Video on Demand app. Get it today.
Welcome back to the Whole Hog Football Podcast.
Each day on the preseason Whole Hog Football Podcast, we'll take a deeper look at a certain position on the Razorbacks roster. Today, we'll take a look at the defensive line. Deke Adams is in his first year as Arkansas's defensive line coach. This is a veteran D-line coach in the SEC. And probably his claim to fame is that, or his biggest claim to fame is that he was a position coach for Jadeveon Clowney at South Carolina about a decade ago. He's also coached defensive lines at Mississippi State, Ole Miss. He spent some time at schools outside of the SEC as well, and he comes in, and it's an interesting group that he takes over at on the defensive line, and you got to look at it from a couple of different perspectives. I think you got to look at the interior players, and you have to look at the ends. From the perspective of defensive ends, it's a really intriguing group. You've got a couple of returning players like Deshaun Stewart, Zack Williams. They brought in transfers, Landon Jackson from LSU, Jordan Dominic from Georgia Tech. You've got a player, Dorian Gerald, who's back, who's battled injuries throughout his career, and he's getting a 7th year of college football this season. Inside is where people, I think, are worried about this team, and particularly the depth. We've talked before about Taurean Carter and the uncertainty that surrounds him. The chances of him playing this year, probably aren't very good because of the knee injury that he suffered during the spring. We know that he underwent surgery. That he's probably not going to be back for quite some time if he's going to be able to play at all this year. Marcus Miller suffered an injury, had to have a knee scope earlier in this preseason camp. Miller probably not going to be a frontline defensive tackle for them, but when you're talking about a defensive tackle group that's already down bodies, when they go down more bodies, it certainly becomes a concern of depth. Isaiah Nichols is back. It seems like every year that he's been at the U of A, he's gotten quite a bit better than the year before. And then they brought in Terry Hampton from Arkansas State, Scotty, who, we were talking about Jayden Hazelwood when we did our receivers podcast earlier this week and how he's taken this big step. Well, Hampton wasn't here in the spring, but it seems like from a defensive perspective, that's kind of the player that you keep hearing about, kind of in the same respect that you hear Hazelwood on the offensive side, that they really like what he can do. It reminds me a little bit of what we were hearing this time last year about John Ridgway.
Yeah, for sure. And I think everybody's introduction to Terry Hampton was when Sam Pittman said that, he's a kind of a little bit of a shorter guy, like he's 6'1", I think, and 300 plus and some change.
314.
Yeah, 300 pounds and some change, and he's kind of got. Sam said he's got some built-in leverage. We talked to Deke Adams the other day and asked him just who some of the stronger guys in his room is, and he literally said that Terry Hampton eats weight in the weight room. And I'm not a very big weight room guy. If you've ever seen me, you can probably obviously tell that. But anytime anybody says that a guy eats weight in the weight room, that's obviously a positive. And he can, he's using that strength to just kind of, I'm not sure if he's throwing guys around, but he's putting that strength to really good use. And, I think maybe early last week, we were talking about things that we wanted to see during the first full week of camp. You wanted to see some guys start to emerge on the defensive line outside of Isaiah Nichols and Eric Gregory on the interior, because Cam Ball was missing time and some guys were banged up. But I think Terry has provided them a little bit of security in terms of depth. Like, he's another guy that, if Isaiah needs a blow, if Eric Gregory needs a blow, because he's playing inside and out, just depending on what front Arkansas is running, Terry can be a guy that comes in and provides you some pretty quality snaps. And it's obviously going to be an adjustment for him coming from Arkansas State. Like, the level of competition is very different. And so he's going to be going against guys like Ricky Stromberg and Brady Latham, Bo Limmer on a weekly basis, sometimes bigger and stronger and faster than those guys. So I think obviously that strength helps him a lot. And sounds like he's pretty quick on his feet too. So I think if you've got that combination right there, I think you're probably going to play a lot for Deke Adams.
It remains to be seen what Hampton is going to do in game action. And I think that, there are probably people listening to this kind of laugh and say, hey, man, tap the brakes. Look at his Arkansas State stats. They weren't that great. But, I think back to something I heard Dave Van Horn talk about earlier this spring with the baseball team. And he was talking in particular about Michael Turner, their catcher, and Chris Lanzilli, their outfielder, who transferred in. And they didn't have any eligibility left after this year. He said sometimes when you have these guys come in from smaller programs as graduate transfers or, whatever kind of transfer they are, he said sometimes you see them appreciate it more, appreciate the program that they're stepping into more. And sometimes you see them work harder because of that appreciation. And so I wonder if the combination of that plus the combination of the fact that Hampton suffered a knee injury that cost him half of his season a year ago in Jonesboro, I wonder if kind of the combination of those two things coming together, and then you add in what is really good defensive coaching with a coach like Adams, a defense coordinator like Barry Odom, who I think a lot of people think is one of the better defensive coordinators in the country. If maybe all of that is combining to make a player that nobody's really ever seen before, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to that. It's probably like, I think he probably understands that people are a little bit skeptical of him maybe being able to produce because he did come from a smaller school and a smaller conference. And so maybe that put a chip on his shoulder to, attack things a little bit more aggressively just to try to get people to really buy into, him being a productive player. And then also, coming off an injury, I think that makes you appreciate the time that you do have on the field, just, having to sit and watch. Obviously Taurean Carter's going through that right now, but I think you appreciate it more just because you have an understanding of, if one thing goes wrong, this might be it. So he's probably attacking things just a little bit more aggressively and probably just out to, prove himself and, just be a valuable part of a defensive line that really needs some playmakers.
Yeah, I think the thing that really intrigues me is I'm just wondering who is the one responsible, or maybe the ones responsible for Arkansas's player evaluations of guys that go into the portal, because they're bringing in guys like Drew Sanders and Jayden Hazelwood, who are 5 stars out of high school, went to premier programs. But then they're also getting guys like Terry Hampton from Arkansas State, who has, virtually nothing on the stat sheet for the past 4 years. And they picked guys like John Ridgway out of Illinois State. And so it's just such a wide variety of guys that they're getting, but then they're getting production out of all of them.
I don't know who's in charge of it, but I would be willing to bet that none of these guys get offers without it coming across Sam Pittman's desk and him really taking a close look and evaluating that game film.
Yeah, one of these days we're going to have to sit down and look at all of the transfers that Pittman has brought in, because he has not missed on very many. It starts kind of with Felipe Franks, and then you go to John Ridgway, made a huge impact, got drafted. Trey Williams is another guy that, in spurts last season really made an impact. I think Hazelwood can be a guy that makes an immediate impact. Drew Sanders too, Terry Hampton. You just kind of go down the list. I think Eric Musselman gets a lot of credit for the way that he plucks guys from the portal, but Sam Pittman and his staff, man, whatever evaluation tools or methods that they have, sounds like they're picking some pretty good guys out of the portal, and you throw Matt Landers into there too. But yeah, I think the success rate on their transfers is really high. And another guy that when we talk about defensive ends, Jordan Dominic is, he can play. He's long and rangy, and Landon Jackson is a legitimate monster. I think he's 6'7" on the end too. So if those guys go out and play well, I think Sam Pittman's reputation as a guy that can get players from the portal is going to go sky high, and I don't see any reason why he won't continue to get them in the future.
And there's some players who, it's yet to be seen what kind of portal additions are going to be. Warren Thompson is one that comes to mind, who had some flashes a year ago, and they want to see better consistency out of him coming in from Florida State. And I know there are others on the roster too. I wanted to go back to something you said before we move on to defensive end, Scotty. And it's when we were talking about Taurean Carter, you saw him a lot during the spring. We really feel like this is going to be a big hit for Arkansas not being able to have him on the field, because he looked bigger. He looked more like the type of player that they had recruited out of Mansfield, Texas. And if he's not able to play for him this year, and certainly I don't think it'll be anytime soon that he'd be able to play for him if he is at all. That's a big hit for them not being able to have him on the field.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, it's a combination of production and leadership too. Like with him and Isaiah Nichols, you felt as solid and confident as possible with those two guys on your front. And if Taurean was healthy, I mean, I think Arkansas could legitimately play, a 4 down front a lot and have really, really good success. He was a guy in the spring that was just consistently in the backfield making things happen. Maybe just before Taurean hurt his knee, Sam likes to stand back behind the offense and kind of get a full field view when he's watching team periods. And he was saying that Taurean was standing back there with him more than any other guy. And he's like, as an offensive line, as an offensive line guy, I don't like that. But as a guy who wants to see his defensive lineman get into the backfield, he likes it. But he was standing back there with Sam a lot. So he was obviously making a really, really good impression. And I think he was definitely probably, in my top 2 guys that were, really on track for a breakout year. It's just really unfortunate that injury happened, at the tail end of a spring drill period where he was, I think he was the standout from those practices.
And I don't want to forget about Isaiah Nichols because I feel like that happens a lot. It happened a lot last year. When Ridgeway was, really getting all these headlines for the play that he had, but he would come out of games and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, there's Isaiah Nichols making another play. There he is making another play. I remember that happening quite a bit in certain games. Texas is one that stands out to me where I thought Nichols had a really good night. He's the leader there in the middle. Regardless of what happens with Terry Hampton, Nichols, I think, is the kind of the leader of that group, at least in the locker room and off the field, maybe on the field too. He's a player, Scotty, that you've watched for a long time, because people may not know this about you, but you covered Springdale High School before you came over and started covering the U of 8 beat for us. So, this is somebody that you've been around for 7-8 seasons now, and you've really seen him grow and mature, and it's been quite the evolution for Isaiah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I remember one of the first big stories that I got assigned for HI was, I think it was the recruiting issue when Isaiah was kind of, he was the guy in Northwest Arkansas to check out on Friday nights because he was just an absolute monster. And he's got an interesting story because he grew up in Warren. I don't think a lot of people know that. He grew up in Warren, but I think because of the church that he was associated with, he didn't play sports. And so he moved to, I believe it was the Little Rock area, went to Elisa Academy, and he started playing sports, but he chose soccer. And he was actually a soccer goalie for a while, which kind of tells you a little bit about the feet that he has, and the hands that he's got are pretty solid. But he moved to Springdale, and pretty quickly, remember Zack Clark, the former Arkansas quarterback in the early 2000s, he was Isaiah's coach, and Zack just always raved about Isaiah, just the character that he's got. I remember I think my last season covering Springdale, Isaiah had one of his best friends, Kyler Williams. He passed away in a car accident. I think the night that Arkansas was playing Texas A&M, and I believe it was 2016. And if you watch Isaiah this year, he changed his number from 93 to 33. So if you're watching Arkansas on September 30 and you see number 33 in the middle of the defensive line, don't know who it is. It's Isaiah Nichols. He's a guy he's motivated to play, and he's got a lot to play for with Kyler. And I believe the other 3 in his numbers represents another person who was close to him in the Springdale School District that passed away during a basketball practice at Lakeside Junior High. So that's a kid that's got a lot on his heart, and he's really, really motivated. He is the heart and soul of that defensive line, and he's just a really, really genuine genuinely good kid. Just wants to just wants to play well, wants to represent Arkansas well. And, I think Sam Pittman, when I asked about him early in camp, he said he's as valuable as anybody that, Arkansas's got on his roster. So he's got a definite big role to play this year.
At defensive end, we had a defensive end analysis on our website this morning, and it really led with Jashad Stewart from Jonesboro, who kind of almost like an Isaiah Nichols has really progressed each year that he's been on campus, to the point that now potential looks pretty good for him to be a starter this year.
Yeah, I think he's going to be a guy that's a high motor guy and always running to the ball, and might not be the flashiest, biggest guy, but he's going to make consistent plays when they need him to. And I think it's important to acknowledge, when you talk about this D-line group and the veteran guys on it, that they're on their third or fourth defensive line coach that they've had throughout their time in Arkansas.
Yeah, I think Eric Gregory and Zack Williams were asked about Jashad on Tuesday, and Zack Williams, I thought, gave a really great quote that, Jashad on every single play gives everything in his being on every single play. And I think that kind of that sticks out to all the other guys. And I think Eric Gregory said that, watching Jashad go all out on every play, give everything that he has, and just that consistent motor that he's got, I think other guys want to be more like that. Because there's obviously, throughout the course of a game, you're winded, you're tired, you're going against a guy that's whipping your tail more often than not. And it's kind of hard to maybe give everything you have on every single play, but that's who Jashad Stewart is. I think that a lot of that goes back to who is coached by Jonesboro, Randy Coleman, just really, really good coach, one of the more well thought of coaches in the state. And Jashad's making a name for himself. Like, I think right now, the thing everybody remembers him for is that tackle for loss where he stripped, I think, an Auburn tailback, maybe on a third down play, replay, overturned it somehow. But I think that's a play that sticks out in a lot of fans' minds. But if Jashad gets more run at this point, he is. I think there's definitely opportunities for him to make similar plays, and with that motor that he's got, I would bet that he would.
You got Zack Williams on this defensive line, who's been around the program for a while. We mentioned earlier Jordan Dominic coming in from Georgia Tech. Landon Jackson, I think, is maybe the most intriguing player to me at defensive end, because he was at LSU, never really played a whole lot there outside of special teams. He hurt his knee. He's coming back from a knee injury. The size and the athleticism is there. I think Scotty called him, almost a monster. Very freaky athleticism that he has. The question, I think, for this defensive front more than anything else is, can they pressure the quarterback? They had 24 sacks a year ago. Much of that, I think, was contributed by Trey Williams, who obviously he had the great game against A&M. He had some other really nice games throughout the season. He contributed a lot of sacks to that total. Sam Pittman in the summer was talking, though, about, there are a lot of different ways to get pressure on the quarterback. You don't necessarily have to have these great rush ends. Sometimes you can get pressure up the middle. And then I think where they think they can get the most pressure, or can potentially get the most consistent pressure this year, Scotty, is coverage sacks. They think they've got the ability with their cornerbacks to, have better coverage down the field, to where quarterback has to hold on to the ball for just a split second longer, and that might help some of this defensive front or the front seven, depending on what they do with their blitz packaging, get to the quarterback. And you wonder too how much blitzing they're going to do this year. That's one thing that Odom has kind of come under fire for, or there's been some criticism for him that he hasn't blitzed enough. And then in the games where they have blitzed, it's been pretty effective for him. So you wonder if maybe those games where they showed more of a blitz late last year makes him reevaluate how much he blitzes.
Yeah, I think when you add a guy of Drew Sanders' talent, I think today one of the things that maybe I should have mentioned earlier from the practice observations is, Drew was working a little bit with Arkansas's defensive ends, and I think Drew is a perfect candidate for Michael Scher and Barry Odom to be like, look, this guy's, I think he's been called an elite pass rusher a couple times in camp, and that's he's a guy that can get into the backfield from that linebacker position. I think he's I think he's really comfortable playing on the edge. And we heard all throughout the spring about that swim move that he's got that just allows him to get by some would-be blockers and get into the backfield and make some plays. Zack Williams is another candidate like to kind of create some havoc too. I remember a couple of years ago, I talked to his dad, Ricky, who I believe was a all Southwest Conference player for Arkansas. He knew that Zack was going to be, this is going to sound really silly, but he said he knew that Zack was going to be an athlete when he was like 8.5 months old. And he told me a story that they were hearing some weird noises coming from their house, like in the middle of the night, like him and his wife were hearing noises. And one night they went to check it out, and Zack was climbing out of his crib at like 8.5 months, 9 months old. And he would climb to the top of it. He jumped off the top of the crib, landed on his feet, ran around the house, climbed back in, and went back to sleep. And Ricky knows talent when he sees it, and he knew that Zack, weirdly enough, was going to be an athlete that that was probably going to follow in his footsteps. And he's made a lot of strides, I think, in the last couple of years, just beefing up in the weight room and adding some weight, getting a little bit heavier, but not sacrificing any of his quickness or his quick twitch. So I think they're pretty solid at defensive end, just with the motor on the other end with Jashad. And Landon Jackson, didn't see a whole lot of him in the spring just because he was recovering from the ACL. Seeing a little bit more of him now, working at second team defensive end in those fastball starts. And I would be really surprised if we didn't see a lot of him, just because, like you said earlier, Matt, he's a freaky athlete, especially at 6'7". You don't find guys like that very often.
And a lot of times you just forget about these players who have had their practice limited, and that they can improve in these practices as the season goes along. And so what you see game 1 might be different from what you see game 7, game 8, game 9. Landon Jackson fits into that. Dorian Gerald might fit into that. I think a lot of people forget that Dorian Gerald didn't go through spring practice this year, didn't get to go through much of practice last year because he suffered that season-ending injury so early in the year. There's still a little bit of a reacclimation process for him. And so it'll be interesting to see with those two guys, how much they improve throughout the season and whether or not that leads to more playing time for them as the year goes along. We appreciate you joining us on the Whole Hog Football Podcast. We'll be back with another one tomorrow to take a closer look at another position. You can go to wholehogsports.com to read our latest football coverage. Also check out Scotty Bordelon's basketball coverage from the Razorbacks exhibition trip over to Europe earlier this week. For Andrew Joseph and Scotty Bordelon, I'm Matt Jones. We appreciate you joining us, and we'll see you next time on the Whole Hog Football Podcast.
The proceeding has been a production of wholehogsports.com. Look for our latest podcasts on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast store. And visit us anytime at wholehogsports.com for the latest news and commentary.